Hello and good evening all. Thank you for joining us. I've got my hard drive back, so we're going to do a re-record this evening. We're going back and taking a slightly deeper and less dully narrated look at the Lola T92/10, which became the prototype of choice for those at the unusual intersection of international drugs trafficking and high-level motorsport in the early 1990s. Work does, of course, continue on both Part 2 of A Brief History of Sports Car Racing and the next 5 cars that video, but so too does life get crazier at each turn of the corner these days, so ETAs, of course, remain TBD. Lola had, in the 1980s, probably experienced their best decade since the 1960s and the T70. Working closely with Nissan and Chevrolet as a chassis constructor, their designs had done fairly well in the Americas in IMSA's GTP class, in Japan in the AJSPC, which is the All Japan Sports Prototype Championship, I think, and everywhere else in the World Sports Car Championship in Group C. However, the Eccleston, deteriorating economic conditions, and a parting of ways with Nissan after the Japanese manufacturer was dissatisfied with the R90 saw Lola without a factory partner for any of these championships, despite their desire to continue competing. And so they decided to focus on the World Sports Car Championship and started on a new clean sheet design that built on their experience with Nissan's R90s, as well as their work with Chevrolet on the GTP. Deciding to do everything in-house and sell complete cars to customers, not dissimilar to some other Group C contestants' Porsche. Although, unlike Porsche, I don't believe Lola had any intentions of supporting a factory team, so there is that. There was initial interest from Mazda before they ultimately pivoted to a Jag XJR14 derivative from Tom Walkinshaw Racing, perhaps leveraged by the fact that both Jag and Mazda were owned by Ford at the time, and thus Lola soldiered on in the belief that, if they built it, a customer would eventually come. So, what did they build? Well, Dutch chief designer Wiet Guidekopper was hired on based on his experience working with Chamberlain Engineering on the C2 Spice SE89, and he brought to bear his education and earlier aerospace design experience to pen what can only be called a Batmobile crossbred with a Formula One car. Guidekopper leveraged extensive wind tunnel development and testing to shape a vehicle that was at least a partial departure from convention for the marque. Taking advantage of the revised rules that had come in with the Eccleston, the T92 had a much pointier nose, more heavily sculpted side pods, and a smaller windscreen and cockpit than previous Lola designs, but it nevertheless had styling echoes of its rivals, particularly in the center-mounted twin-element rear wing, which had strong visual similarities to the Jag XJR14 and Peugeot 905, and again in that cockpit/windscreen cross-section. This was, again, definitely not because the rules were rewritten because Dear Bernie just wanted to force everyone to design Formula One cars with extra bodywork and cockpits so the manufacturers would take the league up to his pageant-focused competitions, but, the requirement that engines had to match the current displacement limits of Formula One cars and thus essentially had to be lightly detuned Formula One power plants was pure coincidence. Bastard killed one of the great eras of racing. Anyway, to this end, Lola ended up sourcing a Formula One-derived, surprise, surprise, naturally aspirated 3.5-liter V10 developed by Judd for Scuderia Italia in 1991, which was subsequently modified to improve the power plant's reliability for endurance racing applications. It was lightly detuned from its Formula One trim, in which it produced 750 horsepower and 345 pound-feet of torque, and for the Lola it made around 650 to 700 horsepower and about 250 to 300 torques. It also found a home in Mazda's 1990s prototypes after their rotary engines were outlawed alongside the slightly more progressively regressive rule shifts that disincentivized older Group C competitors from being competitive against the new 3.5-liter rule machines. In the Mazda, it was detuned a little bit further with additional modifications to make about 600 horsepower, although this would harm the Mazda's competition prospects when it came around to that. Back in the T92, the GVV10 sent its power to the rear wheels through an in-house built 6-speed manual transmission, as semi-automatic systems had only been introduced in Formula One in 1989 and thus hadn't really proliferated to sports car racing yet. The suspension was, as usual, double wishbones with pushrod-actuated springs and dampers. The power plant was mounted amidships as a fully stressed member of the chassis, bolted to a carbon fiber and aluminium honeycomb monocoque, as was the front suspension. The T92's Judd V10, in particular, also had the distinction of being one of the loudest engines to ever run at Le Mans, and having heard it in person at the Le Mans Classic 2 years ago, I can confirm that it makes a decidedly distinctive impression that cannot be adequately conveyed by any digital recording or recreation, and thus I encourage everyone to get out to Le Mans Classic or someplace else where Classic Group C cars will find themselves on track in hopes of hearing it. The carbon composite bodywork, penned and honed by Mr. Huidekopper, derived a significant portion of its downforce from the use of ground effect tunnels under the body of the car, as these were not yet illegal in sports car racing as they had become in Formula One, with the rear diffuser and lower element of the rear wing working not to provide downforce from the typical channels, but rather to essentially extend the ground effect further along the aft end of the vehicle for additional downforce without creating additional drag. But, of course, the upper element of the two-element rear wing certainly made a bit of its own. The front air intakes on either side of the foot and pedal box funneled air to the brakes and radiators, which were mounted laterally for more efficient use of space and maximum cooling, while the big top intake fed air to the engine directly. Brakes were carbon units from AP with 3 pot calipers all around, and the wheels appear to be Lola's own design. I don't have a good macro shot to show you this, but they do say Lola sort of stamped into the hubs, or not hubs, spokes, although I'm privately skeptical as to whether or not they would have actually produced them in-house. This all, of course, sounds lovely, and a model of the car made its debut in mid-1991 to drum up interest for the next year, yielding promising leads from Garage Competition and Kremer Racing. But by the time the car was ready for competition in 1992, the future of Group C was increasingly bleak, due to the skyrocketing costs and stifled innovation brought on by the aforementioned regulation changes. Courage and Kremer, reading the room better than the Lola lads, withdrew from negotiations and elected to see out the sinking Group C ship with their older vehicles. The T92, therefore, had difficulties in finding someone willing to purchase it, and only one team carried through with a commitment to campaign the model. This was Dutch team Euro Racing, who bought 2 cars to campaign in the 1992 season after running their inaugural 91 season in a Cosworth-engined Spice C2 without particularly significant success. This interest, however, brought trouble right here in River City. Trouble with a capital T, and that rhymes with D, and that stands for drugs. Lola's agreeing to sell the new car to Euro Racing frustrated Mr. Huidekopper for 2 reasons. 1. The founder and team principal of Euro Racing was one Mr. Charles Zwolsman, whose business activities involved the transport of large amounts of vegetable matter and very minimal amounts of legality. And I'm not talking about shaking down Roger the Shrubber, who shrubs for illicit topiaries with a nice 2-level effect and a path down the middle. Huidekopper stated in no uncertain terms that he would not be associated with a drug trafficker, and he subsequently resigned from Lola following the car's initial testing period. He would, of course, later go on to work on the Dower 962 LM, the Porsche 911 GT1, the aborted LMP 2000 project, the Dallara Chrysler LMP1s, and Opel's DTM machinery, generally speaking with considerable success, so something of a loss for Lola there. Reason number 2 was that Euro Racing's budget was tight, as I guess all the smart money had moved into more powdery substances than vegetable matter, I guess, and they elected to run their 2 T92s on Michelin tires. These were smaller in diameter than the majority of other racing tires available at the time and entirely compromised the vehicle's suspension setup, as the Lola had been designed to run, well, just about anything else available, namely either Goodyear's, Yokohama's, or Bridgestone's. Michelin tires would have required a total redesign of the suspension to compensate for their having less give than the intended fatter rubber, and Lola resoundingly declined to foot the bill for such work after the Group C class received its death knell in April of 1992, meaning that the car would see only a single season in international competition. Nevertheless, it would at least have that season to do battle as one of the few privateer entries going up against, well, still a denuded field of just Peugeot, Toyota, and Mazda as factory entries. BRM showed up for 2 rounds, but their P351 is probably going to end up in a 5 cars that video because, in the words of Captain Jack Aubrey, success ain't in it. Wearing Ersatz sponsorships to cover up the herbaceous sources of the team's financing, the T92's debut 1992 season was, perhaps unsurprisingly, an unsuccessful one for Euro Racing. The car's initial weak point turned out not to be the suspension, although performance did suffer due to the poor tire choice, but rather the transmission. At the season-opening 500 kilometers of Monza, only one of the 2 team cars, the number 3, managed to take the start, and it failed at less than half of the elapsed race distance with an unspecified malaise of the gearbox. The next round at Silverstone went a little better, with both cars at least making it to the starting line, and the number 4 car would have podiumed had they not been disqualified for the use of an illegal fuel mixture, presumably in some attempt to gain a competitive advantage. It's poetically appropriate foreshadowing the drug lord's car getting hit with the naughty stick for using performance-enhancing substances, isn't it? The other car again managed less than half the race distance, out after 29 laps to the winning Peugeot's 96. It is a reflection of the poor state of competition that there were a whopping 12 entries for both of these races that led up directly to Le Mans, where less than a decade ago there had been more than 40 contestants, but be that as it may. At Le Mans that year, the initial entry list was equally depressing at only 21 cars, with only the new Group C cars accepted, so they opened it up to the older cars to fill out the field. Zwolsman again entered both of his Lolas, reportedly working to strengthen the gearbox and improve the suspension setup in pursuit of better performance than they'd been enjoying so far, and he was co-driver on both cars just to ensure his personal best chances of a podium, even if it probably came at the expense of the team chances. The best car qualified 9th, which was middling, while the race itself was rainy, which reportedly favored the other cars with Michelin tires, those that had been designed to use them. Never truly on the pace of the leading vehicles, with the arguable exception of Heinz-Harald Frentzen in the number 4 car, the gearbox modifications were unsuccessful as well, and both cars struggled with gear selection issues that lost them even more time in the pits, and the number 3 car retired about 7 hours in from gearbox failure. The other car did manage to finish that year, but it was a whopping 80 laps adrift of the winning Peugeot 905. The rest of the year's season, which was foreshortened due to a lack of interest, was similarly depressing for the team. They never managed a podium or had both cars finish a race, and they missed the last race, the 500 kilometers of Manicourt, after the arrest of Mr. Zwolsman on, surprise of surprises, drug trafficking charges. He was actually released on parole and then 8 days later got done again for speeding, at which point he was sent away for a very long time. The 2 cars were seized, along with the rest of the team's and Mr. Zwolsman's personal assets, by the Dutch government. Despite the demise of Group C and the end of the World Sports Car Championship on the whole, it wasn't actually the end of the T92's career. The Euro racing cars were sold off by the Dutch government as recompense for his nefarious activities, and they now reside in private collections, one in the EU and one, I think, in the US, where it reportedly used to participate in HSR events, although I haven't seen it on any entry list since 2020. A third chassis, on the other hand, was purchased in 1995 by McNeil Engineering for use in inter-series competition. Now wearing appropriate Goodyear rubber and competing against modified open-wheelers, its performance improved remarkably, achieving victories at Brands Hatch, Albacete, I think, and the Hungaroring in the late 1990s. It was then converted to race in the International Sports Racing Series, and then again converted to run as an early LMP1, this time rebadged as an Ascari at an attempt to reboot the brand, but without notable success, as it too was frequently plagued by transmission and electrical issues. Happily, though, both of the Euro Racing chassis have been kept in original Group C trim, and, as I mentioned, race at historic events in both the US and Europe. Unlike in their original guys, however, they seem to have figured out the tire thing, because the one that has been providing pictures for this video has usually found itself at the sharp end of the field, which is indeed where I suspect Mr. Huidekopper and the rest of the Lola team always intended it to be. Ironically, Mr. Zwolsman's son also became involved in racing as a driver rather than as a joint driver and team owner, and actually raced at Le Mans with the Bicalis team in 2009, driving their R10 TDI. For this video's shameless plugs for other videos on the channel, we have the general Group C overview with a more extensive explanation of what I refer to as the Ecclestoning of the class, and a moderately in-depth discussion of the history from start to finish. I've covered the Spice SE89 in its own video, I think, along with several other Lolas in their own videos. The Porsche 911 GT1 was covered in DEFCON GT. The Peugeot 908 has its own video, as does the LMP 900. Not LMP 900, LMP 2000. And of course, we had one musical theater reference to The Music Man, a Monty Python reference, and a naval historical fiction reference to round us out. Although those aren't technically videos on the channel, I felt like it was worth mentioning them for some reason. That brings us to the end of this extended re-record. Hope you've enjoyed it. And for this week's call to action, not featuring the 3 sacred words of YouTube.
Like, comment, subscribe.
If any of you, dear listeners, happen to be realtors or estate agents or whatever they call them in your country, stop writing house advertisements in the most oblivious, stupidly optimistic way possible. As a warning, this is going to very much be a angry man yells at cloud call to action rant today, but hear me out with a few specifics for context, because maybe this is just an Americans do American style marketing thing. Every kitchen is not a chef's delight or dream or anything similar. Speaking as someone who does occasionally work as a private chef, and probably would actually have gone into it full time if it weren't for the horrendous hours and much lower pay than management consulting, it's just not accurate. Nobody who has ever worked in a professional kitchen or really cares actively about cooking is going to walk into a kitchen that looks like this and say, yes, this is what I've been dreaming about, or what I'm delighted about. For starters, there's no gas cooktop. If you do not have a gas cooktop, you cannot call it a chef's delight, because I've never met somebody who is enthusiastic about cooking who enjoys cooking with electric. And induction's not bad, but it's still not as good as gas. Moreover, lack of double ovens. Third, there's very rarely enough counter space. Stainless steel countertops would be far preferable to granite, but that obviously doesn't enhance saleability and curb appeal, and I've belabored this particular point long enough. Similarly, what the heck is a sought-after neighborhood? Some of these houses that are listed with being in a sought-after neighborhood have been on the market for months and months, which doesn't seem very sought-after to me. And you're just not creating any sense of urgency when you write that for people who can, immediately scroll down half a page and reveal that you've been on the market for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 months, and you've slashed the listing price by 20% or more since it initially went on sale. Sought after indeed. Another point, hot water heater is a misnomer. If the water was already hot, it wouldn't need additional heating. It is just a water heater. A backyard swimming pool and or screened-in porch does not an oasis make, no matter how many palm trees you put around it. If you really want to create an oasis, try eliminating all other bodies of water for several hundred kilometers, and add some sand dunes, camels, and a caravansary, and then we can talk. Finally, laminate flooring is not luxurious no matter how you slice it, pun intended, nor is luxury vinyl plank, even though it has it in the name, because it's just a not-so-clever marketing technique to imply that it's somehow a totally different product from laminate flooring, when really it's just slightly better laminate flooring. And it is not, no matter how many ways you try to present it, a reasonable alternative to hardwood floors. I'm not saying that it's inherently unpleasant as a flooring material, which, it is, but that's a different issue, but it isn't luxurious in any sense of the word. I suppose if you want to shorten this call to action into something that actually makes sense, rather than as just a rather peeved house shopper bitching about listings, try having a relationship with reality rather than with marketing buzzwords, people. Okay, rant over, and that just leaves it for me to say, as always, thank you for your time this evening or whenever and wherever you are watching, and I do wish you all a good night and a good tomorrow.